We're talking about the impact of tariffs on our industry and really how far-reaching the expansion of the tariffs have become.
We don't have the capacity in this country to manufacture everything that we need to make. So typically something being made here has to be important. So at least a portion of your product is going to be subject to a tariff, which is going to lead to higher prices.
50% of the U.S. economy is made up of small businesses. We are now finding ourselves in a situation where tariffs are touching way more that affects all of those. It's not just one or two products that we can sort of ignore.
The deterioration of our ability to compromise is crippling our country. And until we get back to a point where we can come together and compromise and legislate and not get everything that you want, get some things, we're in trouble.
Strong companies, lasting partnerships, powerful events. Welcome to the Experience Builders Podcast.
Chris, we're going to have to rush this episode out the doors because it's probably going to be off base a little bit here in just a couple of days. But I know it's on everybody's mind. What are you thinking about tariffs?
And I'll tell you, you're right. To make your point, I was preparing for this conversation and I'd made some notes about what the current tariffs were. For example, Canada was one of the examples. And it's changed since this morning, since I was doing it. So you're right. Shameless disclaimer here for our Experience Builders listeners. There's a lot to talk about, but we know that this is, there's a shelf life to some of what we're going to say, because this is not only a very fluid situation, I do believe this is not a short-term situation. So,
Right.
A year from now, I think we're still going to have some version of tariffs, and who knows what that'll look like then. But thrilled that we're having this conversation. We're talking about the impact of tariffs today on the industry, the trade show, and on business events industry. Couldn't be more delighted to have a great subject matter expert, longtime friend of the show, longtime friend of mine, Mr. Rob Cohen. I'll get Rob involved here in just a minute, but for those that don't know Rob is a long-standing general counsel attorney for the industry. He is an entrepreneur, a business owner. He's an investor in businesses and consultant to the trade show industry, and has been one of the leading voices and advocates on this subject of tariffs, not just since the new Trump administration, but I'm going back years. Rob has been a guy we've been leaning on and has been advocating on Capitol Hill as the aluminum tariffs most prominently had been hitting our industry. So, Rob, I can't thank you enough for spending a little time with us today and joining us. So that's it.
Inviting me, Chris.
Before we jump in, I want to set the table. I know there's a lot of people that have different understandings of what a tariff is. Some actually have told me they thought this was just something new for our industry or to the business world since President Trump took office. For those that are new to this subject, I've heard tariffs called an act of war by some people. Tariffs, by definition, are nothing more than a tax on goods. The purpose of a tariff is to raise revenue, to protect industries, and to negotiate trade deals. It's a wonderfully powerful form of leverage for countries that are trying to get other countries to change behavior. Couple of fun facts. The Tariff Act of 1789 was actually one of the first bills that was passed by the United States Congress. From 1790 to 1860, in the United States, the average tariffs that we were assessing increased from 20% to 60% on goods and services coming into our country. They were a major source of the revenue for the federal government as we were building our country right up until the Civil War. From 1861 to 1933, we were known as a country that had some of the highest tariffs in the world. And then the Great Depression hit. And at that point in time, the U.S. began, in search of recovery, to move away from protectionism, which is where tariffs live, and towards the free trade policies that are current day. Later in the 20th century, the United States joined the generally accepted Tariffs and Trade Act. The World Trade Organization came later. We've all heard of that. But it was all about globalization and sort of leveling the playing field. And you did not see tariffs anywhere near have the prominence in the U.S., although other countries certainly use them. I think a few other observations before we jump into our discussion. We're seeing it right now. Tariffs can create a very volatile economy. Rob was telling me at the break, the market was down 750 points this morning. And I guess we should feel better because it's only down 450 midday today. And we've seen that kind of reaction up and down and up and down. Huge swings over the last couple of weeks. There are some companies that may benefit from this kind of environment. Gold industry does well. Energy sectors do well. Infrastructure, certain equity firms, all can benefit from volatility. Most of us, though, and certainly in our industry and small business owners, there's not a benefit. And that's what we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. So that said, I'd like to welcome my two wingmen here to the conversation. Rob, in recent years, you were involved in tariffs as they circled around aluminum and steel, which are two major components in our industry. Tell me how you got involved in what you've been doing right up until present day on tariffs.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. It's a pleasure to be with you guys today. My involvement came both with aluminum and steel under the 232 tariff, as well as the 301 tariff that applied to a lot of general goods, including lighting and electrical products, which greatly impacted a business that I owned at that time. Interestingly, that wasn't the start of tariffs. Tariffs already existed at that point. That was just the start of larger impositions of larger tariffs on goods coming in from primarily China at the time. Those 301 tariffs, the 232 tariffs, they get controlled by something called HTS codes. And every product in the world is assigned by the government an HTS code. And HTS codes then have tariffs assigned to them. And that determines the amount of tariff that an importer needs to pay on those goods as they cross the border and through customs.
Who decides which HTS codes are picked for penalties?
Yeah, so that's all through the government, primarily through the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, which is all part of the executive branch of the government. Congress has nothing to do with the amount of tariffs that are imposed on goods. That is all handled through the powers of the executive branch and the USTR under the executive branch.
Can I ask, is the USTR a guy or is it actually a department? I mean, U.S. Trade Representative, it sounds like there's a person assigned to that, which is an incredibly powerful person if that's a person.
There's someone assigned to be the head of it, and they have representatives from a lot of organizations. And when the 301 tariffs and the 232 tariffs were being proposed, I actually went to Capitol Hill along with hundreds of other people to testify against the tariffs in front of the USTR and representatives of a number of organizations, including the Small Business Administration, and to explain why tariffs weren't a good thing and why they were only a tax on small business.
I want to come back. We've got Legislative Action Day coming up, which we'll talk about a little bit later in the show. But I know you've already been up there and you're talking to Congress, and so we'll talk about whether you feel that's a worthy endeavor. But you just said a mouthful. I think most people think Congress is in charge of tariffs. It's an executive branch decision, isn't it?
It is, right down to the point that before the current president was elected, I was having conversations with Senator Rand Paul's office in Kentucky because he's a free trade person, very much opposed to tariffs. One of the ideas we floated to him was the idea that Congress controls taxes while it has no control over tariffs. And if we have to pay tariffs, why not push small business exemptions and tax relief to small businesses to apply against tariffs that they're paying? And he was very much interested in this until he decided to take a better chairmanship and move on from the Small Business Administration and decided not to lock horns with the current president.
You know what? Leave it to a smart attorney to figure out the language part of it. I've learned that with a lot of a lot of the contracts that we sign, and in particular, a lot of the union contracts we sign, if something in a union negotiation is introduced to a contract, once it's in, I was told, if you don't like it later, you're probably not going to get it removed. You have to introduce new language that's going to minimize or neutralize the impact of that thing you don't like. So to your point, executive branch picks the tariff, but you're saying Congress can introduce tax law that may minimize the impact of that. And can they do that without the executive branch crying foul? Can they actually have an impact on neutralizing the impact of those tariffs by exemptions, as an example?
So they could pass legislation that would give tax relief to small business. The president would have the ability to veto that, and then Congress could override the veto, but that requires a 2/3 vote of Congress.
Well, what's your
I'm curious.
sorry,
I'm
go
curious,
ahead.
Rob. In that same scenario, let me give the first scenario first. So, if there's someone that's importing, they're now paying the tariff. The people that are not importing and are producing in the United States, don't they end up just raising their prices because that's what the markets become? Typically in a tariff situation, is that not always, but isn't that likely what happens?
Well, I think there's a couple of things at play. First of all, we don't have the capacity in this country to manufacture everything that we need to make, including components needed to manufacture things. So typically something being made here has to be imported.
Right.
For example, in my world, you're not going to find all the LED chips that you need in this country. And the great center for that is both Taiwan and China. So you're going to import at least that component into this country. So at least a portion of your product is going to be subject to a tariff, which is going to lead to higher prices.
Right.
Great point.
But even in the case of, like, let's say steel, there's someone manufacturing steel in the US using US steel, and now all of a sudden it's more expensive to get steel from China. Aren't the US steel companies just going to raise their price to what it is in China because that's what the market's bearing essentially?
Or slightly below it. I think.
Just slightly below it.
Right. Right. Why not take advantage of the opportunity to make hay when you can?
So is that not what would happen in the small business case that you just mentioned, where there's an exemption for small businesses on some of these taxations for imports, but they go ahead and keep their prices high and they're just getting the tax cut?
Well, it's also a matter of how companies choose to apply tariffs to their customers. You can do it through increasing the price of your goods, or as my former company did under my direction, we did a separate line item on invoices for tariffs. And what we said was that if you're buying goods from us that are subject to tariffs, you'll see a line item for tariffs on the invoice.
Yeah.
Our naive hope, and I say naive hope now, was that tariffs would get decreased or go away someday, and we would take the tariff away, and we'd have a huge market advantage over our competitors who had already increased their prices. And once someone increases the price, they don't roll them back too often.
Well, and I
Yeah.
love
Well-
the other thing is, I don't know that it avoids the stigma, but everybody, can scream foul when pricing's going up. I love that you were calling out, line iteming literally separately what that cost was. And for me, and I'm also a customer of Rob's, there's no hard feelings. I understand that you have to pass that cost along. You're calling out what it is. I can read what it is. And to your point, should it change, go lower or go away, I have an expectation of that line item getting lower or going away. And there's no bundled in, and then I find myself wondering, did they really, lower taxes or lower prices when they could?
It was an attempt at transparency. It was certainly a marketing strategy as well.
Yeah.
I won't deny that. And, trying to also, as you just pointed out, Chris, to educate the customer as to what's the cost of the product and where is the government goosing.
Well,
I'm
we're a long ways away from that one item being now it's, I don't know how you separate given all the things that tariff policies now
Yeah.
touching.
I'm curious from the industry experts here, whenever there's constraints in any form, people get creative. And I'm curious what you think some of the creative things might happen inside of the industry. Like, are people going to go back to using wood or some of these displays because of some of the issues?
That's a great
So
conversation.
Chris and I
we
had
we
this.
just had this
Yeah.
conversation. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
Rod, we were talking about it at one point because aluminum is such a prevalent component in our industry when everything used to be traditionally wood built. And so, but there was a push for lighter weight because so many other costs on the show floor are related to the weight of your stuff. Khalil, you and I have talked about that in other episodes.
Yeah.
So what just happened with lumber out of Canada, right? It's now 50% tariff on that because it very well could have been that this played out that a lot of traditional custom builders and wood shops started booming as they go back to making things with traditional lumber. And I don't know if anybody at the government level thought of that, but they've now neutralized that as an option to sort of get around that. But I don't know, Rob, how do you view it?
Well, I totally agree with that. And I wonder where the next creative entrepreneur will be. It's not something I want to dive into, but potentially, can you extrude heavy duty plastic that can hold the strength of
Structural,
aluminum
yeah.
and create building sticks essentially out of extruded plastic, which can be done domestically? And I say plastic, it could be a variety of materials, some glass, fiber mix potentially, that can withstand the weights and structural integrity of what's needed to build exhibit systems.
I actually just listened to something about this carbon nanotubes, if anybody wants to look it up, are coming out of, I think it was Rice University. But yeah, it's essentially that. It's that heavy duty plastic that's lightweight, way lighter than aluminum, but also way stronger than aluminum, which is just, crazy to think about. But it can be produced domestically with the resources we already have from oil and gas.
Rob, you shared something.
We've injected, I was just going to say, we've injected molded fixture heads for years made of a plastic glass mix because of the durability as well as the ability to handle heat, even back at the halogen days. So
This is for
Wow.
there are
lighting,
a lot of materials
for lighting
to look
products
at.
you're talking about? Yeah.
Yes.
So you had said something off mic earlier. We were talking about this as an executive branch decision on tariffs and they get to implement or not. But it doesn't sound like it can be just at the whim, right? So you had mentioned IEPA, which is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which is something that the president has to invoke and some logical reason related to that act. Tell me what he did in order to bring tariffs front and center again using EPA.
President can regulate a variety of international economic transactions, including tariffs, including imports, by invoking the IEPA Act. And in the Federal Register, which is a government publication where these executive orders all have to be published because it has to be public information for the world to go and see, back on March 3rd, the president invoked IEPA and said the emergency that he is addressing through at least the increase of the tariffs on China and Mexico, and he'll expand that to the world, is to address the rapid increase of synthetic opioid supply chain. So he says drugs are the problem. I'll narrow it down and make it simple. And we're going to stop the import of drugs by raising the price of imports. And we're going to make all these countries come to their knees. And this isn't a political statement. This is just how things are being handled here. And under IEPA, I have the authority to do this. And then I'll be able to talk to all the countries about how they're going to keep opioids out of this country.
And yet that still is a 250% tariff on milk or dairy products, not milk, out of Canada. There's 50% on lumber. How does that curb opioid flow?
Well, What's fascinating, really, Chris, and on the various tariff councils that I sit on to represent the EDPA, people in major industries talk about invoking legal challenges based on IEPA and saying that the president has usurped his authority by going here and doing that. Well, a lot of industries are also scared to do that because they don't know what retaliation will come from government as a result of that. And that's where all the balancing is taking place now. And there are some 1,000-pound gorillas on this group, from the aluminum can industry, for all of our beer, soda, et cetera, to the National Retail Federation, to a myriad of the automobile industry representatives, and little lowly EDPA, right?
Yeah.
In comparison to some of these. And it's very, I'd say, fascinating if I wasn't personally involved in it and watching it. Maybe disheartening is the better word, to see that people don't even want to fight this because of the fear of retaliation.
Can I ask you, Rob, if an association like ours, or maybe a larger association, files a lawsuit to stop it, does it stop once the lawsuit's filed until there's a ruling, or does there have to be a judgment and a ruling to actually stop it?
So there would have to be a judgment and a ruling. So one of two things happens. Either you seek a preliminary injunction to stop the enforcement of the IEPA tariff that's being suggested, which you have to show irreparable harm to get that issued by a court, or you have to wait till the final ruling on the case. And the problem that we're seeing right now in the court system is that judges are ruling along the lines of their appointments. So if they were appointed by a liberal-sided Democrat, they're ruling one way on an issue. Then the issue gets appealed to a higher court where there's a more conservative judge who hears the case, who rules in the other direction. Ultimately, this continues until you get to the Supreme Court, which is heavily weighted to the Republican side. And I hate to say politics is coming into a significant play in our judicial system.
Yes,
but it is.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I want to try and stay on point. This is a fascinating discussion, and there's a lot of ways we could take this, but I want to catch up on a couple of interesting points and stay on point as it relates to our industry. I just did the math. So the lumber, which could have been potentially an alternative path to build exhibits, back to more affordably of what it may be turning into. But the tariff, if I just did a 40%, not 50, the average single family home, you would be looking at between $7,500 and $10,000 in additional lumber costs.
Unless, Chris, the builder was able to procure U.S. produced lumber only. And the current administration's argument is that they're going to open up forestry and the harvesting of trees and lumber.
So it's funny.
There'll be plenty supply.
When we looked historically back, in the 19th century of tariffs as this country was being built, agriculture and farming were two of the industries that were most benefiting from those types of things. So I get that. So I had
this time, though. The difference this time, Chris, is that on the agricultural side, those exporting goods are being hit with huge tariffs going the other way now as well.
Yeah. I had a conversation this morning driving in with our friend, our government affairs vice president, Tommy Goodwin, at the Exhibition and Conferences Alliance. I know you are no stranger to Tommy, share a lot of screen time together. And we were discussing other areas of our industry that the tariff strategy is impacting. And he started talking about the show organizers, the people that own the shows. One of the reasons that investors in general, and we're probably seeing this play out in the volatile market, the U.S. is considered and has been considered for a long time the least risky market in the world. So it's one of the reasons dollars flow to the the U.S. stock exchange. It's one of the reasons we have 13,000 trade shows in North America. And yet, this is not a situation that is reducing or maintaining a low-risk environment. There has been a trend, Tommy was talking about, and I'm aware of this from my visit with the CISO conference 2 years ago, Society of Independent Show Organizers. There's a lot of interest in the Middle East about shows and the expansion of conferences and expositions there. So much so that Europe has already lost a lot of shows because of movement over there. So the discussion is, does this only add fuel to show organizers looking for an alternative to the United States to actually host their event? And what potentially impact does that have on our businesses here? Any thoughts on that?
I think the roll of the dice on that, if you were to move a show from the United States to the United Arab Emirates, wherever you may decide to go, is will you get the American attendee to travel to the show? And that's a huge expense. And, the shows at least taking place here in the States, by the best statistics I'm seeing, are at most 25% foreign attendees. So
it's about 30, it's about 30% to your point. So, but if that cost gets pushed to the U.S. business person because of other variables not in their control, they just may go, Jimmy Crackhorn, and I don't care. Somebody's going to pay for the travels. And I think owners are going to look at, I don't necessarily have your same costs of your material handling and drayage model. I don't necessarily have the same union costs that are associated in the U.S. model. So this would be just another really big thing that could potentially tip that over. And I don't think there's going to be an exodus in a year or two, Rob. But I do think if they go, at the end of the day, it's still going to be cheaper for audiences. Again, if 2/3 of the audience is American, can we get that down to half of that? And so I think it's a genuine concern. I don't know how immediate that impact would be.
Yeah, I think the other piece that has to be examined is, what is the cost for an American company, small business, to go and exhibit overseas, wherever these shows go? And I think it will be absolutely prohibitive for most. And I think that's why at least the U.S. business, I think, is potentially safe for the long term. You may have some shows that might move. It's also why, on a webinar to the Las Vegas chapter of the EDPA on the subject of tariffs, which I was shocked that like 60 people attended it on a local level to understand what was going on. One of the things, I was asked, well, what do we do to protect ourselves? And I said, well, the first thing you do is on every quotation you send out, you make sure it's clear that this pricing is subject or is based on current tariffs, taxes, and duties, and that any changes in those tariff, taxes, and duties will potentially change the pricing of this quotation. Because you can't, to your point earlier today, Chris, you can't hold your price valid for 48 hours right now because you don't know what's going to happen.
It's a great point. And that was somewhat problematic when we were thinking about lighting and aluminum, although we weren't having the speed of change, which we're seeing right now. But the way that this has opened up in the last month and a half, this is now a tier 1 problem about how good is your estimate for the way that's moving. And I think only time's going to tell about, will this be swinging like a pendulum back? We've seen that happen a couple of times with tariffs in Canada and Mexico. And, honestly, in the beginning, I thought, it's the original intent. You put a tariff in, it disrupts the behavior that you're unhappy with, and you're seeing people make improvements and changes. It looks like a brilliant strategy, but it's not a brilliant strategy, as now you're seeing others come back with retaliatory and just across the board tariffs. And I don't think I'm a small business owner doing forecasts for both revenue and budgeting. And it is the wild, wild west right now with my leadership team as we're trying to just forecast what the next quarter and the rest of the year is going to look like. So,
But that thought process, Chris, is also the thought process on tariffs is also one in a vacuum, because ultimately what the administration is saying is that these tariffs are going to drive American jobs, so American manufacturing, and we're going to make more here. We don't have a workforce to do
well,
that.
that's an excellent point. We know this is another huge subject, which we've tackled many times. We have a workforce problem, and there's a shortage. There's a talent shortage. There's a body shortage. If the strategy worked and U.S. and companies started saying, we're building plants in the U.S. because we want to skip the tariffs. I know the plants aren't going to be built overnight, but this is a generational problem on labor. There's no quick fix there. So to your point, this is a very complex and difficult thing to see happening.
I'm boggled in Massachusetts, where I live, to read the news reports that there are more kids that want to go to trade schools than there are slots to attend trade schools. And yet local government's doing nothing to expand the number of slots to attend trade schools.
By the way, I think my takeaway there is the title for your memoir, Boggled in Massachusetts. No, you're right. Supply and demand. So, this is really amazing to think about this. But then you take the whole disruption in the academic world, right? And to your point about how people are feeling about 4-year academic degrees and the costs of that and the return on that investment. So you are having this awakening to trade skills jobs and what that pay is. And maybe there isn't a stigma, because I think we were all told when we were much younger, you must go to a 4-year academic college. Being a plumber is not a real job, or a mechanic. It's fine for a hobby. And that's just not the case anymore. So all these things are converging, that the awakening of trade skills, the demand for it, the growth in sectors of the economy that need it, and then, of course, the aging out of a lot of the, 56, 58 and above. And there is now a push to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. in a bigger way than it's ever been pushed. I don't know how. I don't see it yet. I don't see the winning chess strategy to win that game.
I've got a question for you, Rob, more of a scenario-based situation, because I know that you're kind of, you've changed what your day-to-day looks like for what it's been like for the last long while. And like you said, you're eager for what the next entrepreneurs are going to do. So you're not really looking to start anything just yet at this point in your life. But if I was tasking you with becoming a new exhibit house or exhibit builder, what would be your approach to running an operation today with the climate of tariffs? How would you approach planning for tariffs and strategy around tariffs?
So I am engaging in one new startup, and I'm not going to give away what that is.
Perfect.
But you have to find ways to come together as a community, to be able to brainstorm and cost effectively deliver to your community, and not be so concerned about competition with it, because there's plenty of business to go around. And I think there needs to be a lot of thought given around that area. I think there needs to be a lot of thought about how we all sell, whether it's products or services, such as exhibits and exhibit rentals and exhibit building and that sort of thing, and how we go about creating those models that can be more cost effective for the business owner, and how you can pool more backroom services that have nothing to do with competition, so that you can have some shared services and lower costs. I think that's what's critical for that marketplace. I also don't think that the tariffs are short-lived, and my real reason for that is that once something like the government creates a significant source of revenue, they're not going to shut that faucet off fast.
Yeah.
We've already seen the government collect over $300 billion in tariffs. And let's remember, for anyone listening, those are not being paid by foreign companies. Those
by Americans.
tariffs are being paid by Americans and American companies, and call them a tariff, they're a tax, as Warren Buffett, who's a lot smarter than I am, calls them.
Yeah.
You know, they're not going away.
Are you saying that they've already collected $300 billion from the tariffs that have just been imposed since Trump got in office, or from 2008, 16?
Last 4 years. I think the last 2 years.
I call it Trump 1.0.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
at the start of the 232 and 301 tariffs, and let me be clear, it's not political. There was Trump 1.0, Biden 1.0 continued the tariffs when they were about to expire, and then had plans in place to increase those tariffs. So this is cross-party now. And
Right.
now we're dealing with Trump 2.0.
So really it's 300 billion over the course of almost 9 years.
But keep in mind, most of those tariffs were just on goods from China. Now
Right.
we're talking about the world. Forget
And
the word
we've doubled
billion.
them
Now
on
we
China,
go to
right?
right. Now we go to trillions.
Wow.
I think
Well,
I
and,
think
you know,
with
it's-
I think Trump 2.0 in that world, the leadership in the current administration, I don't know what it is, Rob Killer. Maybe are they thinking about from the Civil War to the Great Depression, tariffs were how we rebuilt the country. It's where the revenue came from. It's where they were the highest in the world, and it was the revenue that we collected that built our country. I don't know this for a fact, but I don't think we had as developed countries back then overseas that were instituting reciprocal tariff consequences, which what is that doing to interest rates? What's that doing to the value of the US dollar? Right? The game is, if you're reading history, I could see how somebody currently who's supporting this is going, no, this works. I understand it's a departure because we became a free market globalist kind of society. This is what we need right now, given our debt, given our deficits. This is how we're going to, but I don't think it was completely thought through how the rest of the world's going to react. And ultimately, nobody has told me what are the consequences going to be on the dollar in interest rate. So
The other thing that I think we have to keep in mind is that this may not be a 4-year experiment. Midterm elections could swing who has control of Congress. And at that point, there could be additional pressures and alternative things done to combat the tariffs, such as taxation matters, things like that. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what the midterm elections hold. And there are lots of people that are already saying that they're not going to run again, whether that's because of age or for other reasons.
Yeah.
It's an interesting, so the subject, guys, we're talking about the impact of tariffs on our industry and really how far reaching the expansion of the tariffs have become. My takeaways listening so far, guys, I think the things to think about is this is honestly for years, Rob, all I've thought about is the cost of aluminum, cost of lighting products, right? And now the broader reaching impact of tariffed products, like I said, the impact on inflation, which I'm hearing if you listen to Larry Summers, who is a guy who I greatly respect. He's been a Treasury guy, he's been a Fed guy, and he's like, we're back to worried about how disruptive a recession is going to be this year. We weren't hearing that in fourth quarter of last year. We were hearing maybe some inflation. I think, and Rob, you brought up a great point, the consequences of tariff success. So if you successfully bring manufacturing back to the U.S., what are the interest rates going to be to build these plants? What is the workforce going to look like to staff these plants? And while I know there's no immediate need if we see 1,000 companies want to build manufacturing plants in the United States, it's going to take a little time to build those, provided they can afford it. The workforce problem is a generational problem. Those plants are going to be ready before the talent is ready, right? So it is just I'm wanting to hear from someone in the government or the team that's in charge that they have a plan for all that, and I shudder that they may not.
And without trying to be political, if you're shutting down immigration into the country, that's what a lot of the workforce, for these harder, lower paying jobs, still good paying, but lower paying jobs,
Yeah.
That's where a lot of that firepower comes from, because people that are multi-generation in this country aren't looking to do those jobs.
Well, I think, look,
Yeah.
this really is all connected together, isn't it?
Mhm.
I think most Americans are pro-immigration because our parents and our grandparents came across. I think we need to fix the system so there's a legal, organized way that immigrants, but there's no question that we need to have immigrants coming in. We don't have that workforce. I don't think that means that's permission for people to come in the way as recklessly and sort of frenetically as we've seen in the last few years. And, it's interesting. You saw, I'm sure we've all read the proposal we're hearing out of the administration for gold green cards, right? And are you really going to sell $5 million card to a really well-vetted person who's only got great intentions for America? It's going to be investing in America, and they'll buy cards for key employees. And, if we get 1,000 to do it, that's $1 trillion, and we could pay off the debt. By the way, and I'll give you guys the last word on this, I really would love to hear a plan that, if the goal of this is the tariffs is to pay down the deficit, and I got to tell you, I'm a deficit hawk. We have $36 trillion is unconscionable. We continue to live 1.8 trillion a year beyond our means in our budget. I was, demoralized when I heard the guy I look up to, Tommy Goodwin, on Capitol Hill go, I just don't think you're going to see a balanced budget come out of Capitol Hill in our lifetime, which is horrible. But it seems like this crazy stuff, the stuff that seems craziest right now, would all make sense if it were a plan to, the Doge initiative to cut waste. And I think we all agree there's probably a lot of waste in there. But, tariffs and waste, and if Congress passed a law that money must be used to pay off the debt, which is an existential threat to the security of this country, okay. But I'm not hearing anybody talk about that. So it's just it just raises more questions. So what are your thoughts on any of this? And what's the thing that our industry should worry about the most?
Yeah. My closing thought is, one, I'm not running for public office when I say this, but the deterioration of our ability to compromise is crippling our country. And until we get back to a point where we can come together and compromise and legislate and not get everything that you want, get some things, we're in trouble. In the early days of my career as an attorney, I remember arguing a motion before a judge, and the judge looked at me and said, I've heard all that crap before. Let me teach you a lesson, son. A good settlement is one that neither party loves. They're just willing to go along with it and move forward. And that's where we have to get back to,
Amen.
We're a divided country. There's no question about that. Politically, we're divided in our thought. And anyone who didn't believe it before now has to believe that. And to move forward anywhere, we're going to need compromise.
Amen to that. Khalil, what's your takeaways from what's jumping out?
Man, I think obviously as a small business owner, it's kind of just over your head. You got other things to worry about. And this just makes it seem so stressful. And it's just sometimes ignorance is bliss, but until it isn't, right? And so I think for the small business owner out there that's listening, my approach is stay attentive. Just keep listening, keep your ear to the ground, have people that you trust that are really in the weeds on this that you can look to, kind of like Rob, for example, for advice, for counsel, and then start thinking creatively. If things did change and all of a sudden you can't get access to the main things that you need, or clients start leaving you because their costs have gone up and they can't afford to pay for you as an agency owner, for example, what would you do? And just start to know what those creative options are going to be for you, different offerings that you have for clients, different materials that you might use, different approaches you might have to delivering your services, and start thinking about those things now before things happen, and know what the triggers are for those things. That's probably the biggest thing that I'm taking from this. Or, hey, what would I do if X happened, or if Y happened, et cetera, et cetera. So,
great point. Staying attentive and keeping your head on swivel. It's interesting, guys. I appreciate this conversation. I was in the conversation. I didn't hear any political slants from any of the three people on this call. I heard three business owners and business leaders talking about the concern of what's happening as it's impacting the small business community. By the way, 50% of the U.S. economy is made up of small businesses. And we are now finding ourselves in a situation where tariffs are touching way more that affects all of those. It's not just one or two products that we could sort of ignore. I agree with Khalil. I don't think this is something we can sit here and offer up suggestions on. But what we can do is say out loud, this is now impacting and hurting small business. We want the full plan, because right now we're not seeing it. And it might be a great way to remind the group that in 2 months and a week, right, we have our one day up at Capitol Hill. Rob and I go every year. It is Legislative Action Day for the Exhibition and Conferences Alliance. We had about 141 of us that registered to go and went last year. We met with 37 different states and elected officials and their staff on the importance of small business. We're expecting 200 or maybe even breaking that number this year. It's important that you go. And if you haven't registered yet, we'll put a link in the show notes. But we need you up there. And if you haven't gotten it from this call, it's more important than ever that they hear from us loudly that, whatever this plan is, it's a partial plan at best, and it doesn't seem to be working. And maybe we think you haven't thought about all the consequences of how it's going to slow down the economy, which is, we went through this already on a 4-year ride called pandemic, and we just got back to rebuilding an industry, and we are not looking to get derailed again. So I appreciate this conversation. You're absolutely right, Rob. This thing is going to change so many times. I hope you're willing to come back and unpack it again with us when we see whatever it becomes. At the very least, let's do one after our Legislative Action Day visit, and we can tell the Experience Builders listeners what we learned and what we're hearing from our elected officials up there. But May 29th, Washington, D.C. I hope everybody's going to mark that calendar. Hit Rob or myself up on LinkedIn if you want a connection on how to register. But critical thing we do, we can't, we're not invisible anymore, but we do need to speak up for ourselves. And right now we have concerns, and thanks for helping me unpack them today. Appreciate you.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate your time today.
See you on the next one, Khalil.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Experience Builders podcast. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more great content. Visit our website at crewxp.com to learn more about us. See you in the next one.